There's football tonight in the Big Ten. In fact, there are two games for your viewing pleasure. Penn State and Purdue, a game you can see over on Fox. Significant showdown between two teams with very lofty expectations. And then here on the Big Ten Network, we've got the Gophers season opener. They welcome former coach Jerry Kill and the Aggies of New Mexico State. A ton of excitement, of course, about this Minnesota program and whether or not perhaps this is the year that they captured the Big Ten West. As you would expect, a lot of social media buzz as well surrounding those games tonight. Just fired up when football gets going, and it begins in earnest this weekend. We had a couple games last week to whet our appetite. 13 Big Ten teams play this weekend. Let's start with Penn State and Purdue, and really a fascinating game to me. Penn State, we know the story from last year. They got as high as number 4 in the nation after the great start. They lose 6 of 8 down the stretch. Sean Clifford got banged up. They never got the run game going. They're taking on a Purdue team that won 9 games a year ago. Let's focus first on Penn State. When they have the ball, what will you be watching tonight in year 2 under Mike Yurcich?
How about the atmosphere, though, first? How about I'll see your whiteout and raise you a blackout?
Yes,
I mean, it's
yes.
going to be incredible.
Oh, it'll be nuts. Yep.
I mean, this is well-timed for Purdue. So you look at the run game. Everybody knows that that's where Penn State's offense has to improve. So the run game has to do with a couple things. First of all, personnel. And so most of the time when we talk about run game, we talk about the offensive line. You know, as we went around on the tour, I thought there were 3 offensive lines that separated themselves: Ohio State, Michigan, and Wisconsin. After that, Rever, I thought they all pretty much looked the same. I mean, you could rate them a little bit closer than I'm rating them, but as a group, no one other than those 3. And the reason I bring that up is we've been saying Penn State has to improve their run game. They have to improve their offensive line. Well, I'm not so sure that's correct. They have to improve their run game, but they have to do it probably with the offensive line that they have. And that's going to be about play selection and play calling. So then you look at Mike Yurcich, and I went back and looked at Mike's history, you know, not all the way back to being a GA for me in Indiana, but since he became a high-profile.
He's really overcome it, hasn't he?
Yes,
He's overcome his history.
He has fought adversity, which is really good. But when he was at his best, he did want to be balanced, because you can't say you want to improve your run game and never call it. Plus, think about this. The blackout, I mean, that's going to play a factor in the game, because if you can't run the ball tonight, if you're Penn State, and those fans get into that, and you make it a pass rush drill, meaning that the only way Penn State can try to move the ball is to throw it, it's going to be a significant disadvantage for Penn State. So they've got to improve the run game. They have to be patient with the play calling. You know, it might look ugly in the first quarter on 1st and 10. And when you talk about run game, you're basically talking about 1st and 10 and short yardage, right? You've got to keep the defense balanced at 1st and 10, and then in short yardage, obvious situations, you have to be able to run the ball. So Mike Yurcich has got to be patient with the run game and hope that his offensive line is better than it's been. And the offensive line, since Joe was there, has always been a struggle for Penn State, which is a really strange thing. But it's become fact now. And so you better deal with it with play selection and maybe scheme.
What's interesting to me, and you're right, I mean, and this is something that James talked a lot about when he got there, which was that the sanctions really hurt them on the offensive line. It was going to take time to rebuild it. I don't think even he would have envisioned that it would take this long to rebuild it. And they have recruited well. I mean, it's not, if you look at the rankings,
absolutely, right.
Whether or not it's turned into a good offensive line, I think it's pretty obvious that for whatever reason it hasn't. I thought was pretty funny at Media Day this year, where he said, I'm not going to promise you that we're better in the offensive line, because the truth is I come in and promise it every year, and we really haven't been. It feels like you believe, and I know I believe too, that this is an offensive line issue more than it's a running backs issue, right? I mean, and you look at this year, I mean, Singleton and Allen, these 2 freshman backs, Singleton's a Gatorade National Player of the Year last year. I mean, you could see why when we watched him in camp, he looked really good. But I mean, even like when Saquon Barkley was there, they didn't have a great offensive line then either. Right. So you really believe it is more an offensive line issue than a running back issue, yes?
I do, but I also believe that's an issue that most of the teams in the Big Ten have, just because they don't have great offensive lines. Look at Northwestern, for instance. They got Skoronski, who's a great player, but the other 4 are good players, and they rush the ball. Their rushing attack won the game for them against Nebraska.
Yeah, won it great.
So they found a way to run the ball. Now, it was different circumstance and all that. Again, I think this blackout is going to be a major factor in this game. Emotion emotionally. And again, when you don't run the ball and you're in a stadium like that, and then you start throwing it, it's a problem. But yes, I do think it's mostly the offensive line. And so you just have to be patient, especially on the road.
What did you see from Purdue's defense when we were there? I mean, they turned into a pretty good defense last year. They held 4 opponents to under 10 points, which, I mean, you think about kind of the history of Purdue football, that doesn't happen. In fact, it was the first time since 1978 they had done that in the same season. They lose George Karlaftis, who, of course, was somebody you always had to account for when you're an offensive coordinator. How good do you think this defense will be?
Well, they're not going to replace George. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The defense is going to be good because Ron English is going to be aggressive, the defensive coordinator. And Jeff Brom last year started this where he brought 3 co-coordinators in and said, look, I want to play defense like we play offense. I want to roll the dice. I want to bring some pressure. If we give up a big play, it's on me. I'll get a big play back on our offense. So the defensive coordinator at Penn State, Ron English, is in a lot different shape and a lot different position with his offense than a lot of defensive coordinators are.
Let's talk about when Purdue has the ball. This is a dynamic attack now under Jeff Brom. It has become really pass exclusive, or it certainly was last year. They averaged the fewest run yards per play, rushing yards per run of any team in the country. He said to us when we were at camp, look, we have to be able to run the ball adequately. You know, if it's 90 yards, 100 yards, 110 yards a game, just something to make them at least consider the possibility of defending the run. What do you think about that matchup, their offense against a Penn State defense that is strong in that back seven, and particularly in that secondary, I would say, in the back against a strength that is Purdue's passing attack?
Well, first of all, I hope Matt Millen's not watching, and he might be because it's about Penn State, because defense isn't as important as it used to be. And hang on, Matt, the run game is not as important as it used to be either.
Right.
And so Purdue can win the game without a run game. I don't think Penn State can win the game without a run game because, as Jeff Brom says, we have to run it adequately. That means on 1st and 10, there has to be some thought in Manny Diaz's mind that it could be a run play. Now, Jeff Brom's issue is the defense going to be probably mostly what Penn State has done in the past, but Manny Diaz is an accomplished coach. He's an accomplished defensive coordinator. He's going to have some tweaks that he wants to use. So it might take Jeff a little bit of time to figure out what adjustments he has to make, because they probably have prepped for Penn State scheme from the past few years and a little bit of what Miami's done. So there's going to be a lot of head scratching on the Purdue sideline for a while to make sure that their game plan fits whatever defense they anticipated.
Who is it harder for? Is it harder for Jeff Brom not having seen Manny Diaz at Penn State, not understanding the mix of Manny with that personnel? Or is it harder for Manny trying to learn his personnel, trying to learn the logistics of how they're kind of going through calling plays and communicating with James, and also going up against what is one of the best passing attacks, not just in the Big Ten, but in the country?
Yeah, even though you described the passing attack accurately, I still think it might be harder for Jeff because what happens if it's significantly different? It's not that Jeff won't know what play to call. You know, and I say this all the time. Head coaches calling plays that play quarterbacks are a fascinating watch. I mean, they're actually playing the game as if they're under center, and that's how Jeff plays it. And he was in the XFL when I was in the XFL. He was a great quarterback and a great competitor. But still, the players have to be able to block a front they hadn't practiced against. So I think if you said who's going to have the bigger adjustment, it would be Jeff, but not because of what to call, but to make sure all 11 players knew what to do if he made an adjustment on the sideline.
Well, that is really interesting to me, because I guess I would have, as a layman, I would have thought the other way, right? Because Manny's doing 2 things, right? He's putting in his new defense, and he's adjusting to players that he has never coached before.
But he knows the offense.
But he knows what's coming at him. Yeah. No, it's
it's
really
a mix.
interesting.
It's a mix.
Yeah. Purdue's never scored more than 28 points against Penn State.
Really?
It'll be very interesting to see if tonight is the night, be the 20th all-time meeting, a series that Penn State has absolutely dominated. Purdue just 3 wins all-time against the Nittany Lions. But, man, this just feels like such a big game, really, for both of these teams.
Absolutely.
But if you win this with Purdue and their crossover schedule, this is, at least on paper, their toughest crossover game because they don't play Michigan or Ohio State. You think maybe it could be a special year for them. I do want to talk about the Gophers tonight. I like Purdue. I think they're kind of a popular dark horse in the Big Ten West. I think maybe there's a little less certainty about kind of that Wisconsin-Iowa duo than there has been in the past, and Minnesota's one of those popular teams to kind of break through. I know we were really impressed by them when we saw them in practice. What are you most interested in seeing tonight, particularly given the return of Kirk Ciarrocca as offensive coordinator?
Right, so Kirk Ciarrocca was there a couple years ago, and everyone would say, how come he calls the slant pass so much? That was actually an RPO. He was reading the second-level defender, and if the second-level defender defended the run, they threw the slant behind him. Then he went away for a couple years, won at Penn State, and then he was at West Virginia as an analyst. And in his words, he studied the game like he could never study it being an active coach. And so I say that to say this. It's going to be interesting to see. I think they have to throw the ball better to win the West. They're an outstanding coach team. They're going to have a winning season. They'll meet expectations. But to win the West, I think they have to throw it. So that brings me to Kirk Ciarrocca. So what difference is he going to bring to that offense than he was? I don't think they can, when he was there the first time, I don't think they can run as many RPOs as they've run in the past, because RPO, whether it's a run or pass, is decided by the defense, not by the offense. So when the offense snaps the ball, they don't know if it's a run or pass.
Yeah.
They have to have a pass game when they obviously call the pass game and are a little bit more efficient. Now, PJ wants to be run first, pass second. I mean, he wants to be 60% run and 40% pass, and I don't think that's going to change, but the percentages would be higher than that, as you studied the numbers, correct? A lot higher, probably.
Yeah, I mean, last year, the only teams that ran the ball more than them were the service academies.
Right, I heard you say that.
Yeah,
I go, oh, my goodness.
It's incredible.
Right.
Yeah, in terms of rushing plays last season, only the service academies ran it more than Minnesota did. 46 rushes per game. I mean, it is incredible. 257 pass attempts, the fewest of any non-service academy.
So if you're going to run that, if you're going to run the ball that much, the service academies are going to tell you, we have to run the ball to win. And I don't think that's true at Minnesota. Minnesota has to run the ball to win enough games. But if they want to win the West and have a chance to win the Big Ten championship, I think they have to evolve a little bit offensively. But they're not going to be crazy pass. But yeah. Kirk Ciarrocca, I think, will give us some different things to look at. Maybe not tonight, or whenever they're playing. Tonight or tomorrow?
They're playing tonight?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be here. Remember?
It's Thursday night. Yeah,
are you going to show up?
I got it right here.
You're going to be here, right? Yeah. New Mexico State, Jerry Kill, the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I even have what I'm doing when I leave here.
I'm not sure I'm going to ask you to reveal that. The kind of the comfort zone for Tanner Morgan, I think there's been so much question here over these last couple of years of why he has not been the same quarterback that he was in 2019. I understand everything that you're saying about Kirk and the defense is going to dictate a lot of what they do offensively. And let's be honest, I mean, they had two NFL wide receivers who have moved on that team in 2019. I think they have some good guys. Ottman Bell's really good. I really like Dalen Wright, who transferred from A&M. We thought he was great in preseason last year, and he made an impact and looked good again in camp this year. But just psychologically, does that make a difference for a quarterback?
It does. The difference for Tanner, I believe, is more relationship with Kirk Ciarrocca than it is the plays that were called. And, both those guys are really personal guys. We've been fortunate enough to be around both of them. And Kirk's just a guy that glues himself to the players. And, when you ask PJ, it's unusual that you would bring back a coach that left. And he said, maybe it's unusual, but the players are really excited. And we have an obligation as head coaches to make sure that our players, that we give them someone that they can work with, that they really like and all that. So I don't think it was as much the play calling the last couple of years for Tanner. I think it was the personal relationship with Kirk Ciarrocca, and I think that Tanner will flourish with him there.
And if you're PJ Fleck, you had a ton of success with Kirk Ciarrocca. I mean, you had success after he left too. They had a really nice year last year, but I'm just saying, why wouldn't you? Right? You sublimate your ego and you say, this is a guy who's a good friend. He took an opportunity that felt like a good opportunity for him. I get it. And now I get to welcome him back. And
I know, but sometimes head coaches don't think that way. I mean, my first year at Vanderbilt, Fred Jackson was my quarterback coach, and then he left for Michigan, and I got mad at him. And some of
who would choose Michigan over Vanderbilt?
Some of the old,
old
coaches and mentors of mine, as I was telling them how furious I was, they said, really? Seriously? You left Eastern Michigan to go to Colorado. Did the guy at Eastern Michigan got mad at you?
Yeah. Speaking of people coming back, Jerry Kill and the Aggies on 4 days rest. They played on Saturday. They lost to Nevada They play tonight. Big Ten football sponsored by Hampton by Hilton, 9 Eastern here on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. The Gophers and Aggies from Minneapolis. It is time for our big stat. As you are likely aware, Ohio State opens with Notre Dame on Saturday night at the Shoe. Buckeyes trying to extend their national best 22-game season opening win streak. That is 2 longer than Alabama. Last season opening defeat for the Buckeyes came in 1999 against Miami of Florida. As we continue here, we are very pleased to welcome in Bruce Feldman. Of course, you see him on Fox Sports. You also hear him on the Audible podcast with Stuart Mandel. They stooped so low as to have me as a guest this week. And so what goes around comes around here. Bruce, fabulous to have you on once again this week. Let's dive in with Notre Dame, Ohio State. This does feel like the game of the week in college football coming your way on Saturday. There's so many storylines here. Marcus Freeman against his alma mater. You got Jim Knowles and that new Ohio State defense. What piques your interest the most in this one?
Well, for me, Dave, to be honest, it's can Notre Dame's offense keep up with what I think will be the best offense in college football this year? I just think that C.J. Stroud has so many weapons. And while Notre Dame is a top 10 team, Tyler Buchner, he was a very hyped up recruit. He's a good dual threat quarterback. First real start, though, and now you're going to do it. I mean, the analogy I would have is if you're a quarterback going up against this Ohio State team, I feel like it's like you're in a 3-point shooting contest with Steph Curry. Like, good luck. From a viewing standpoint, hopefully it'll be entertaining still in the second half because I could see by the second half, I just think it'll be hard to keep up with the Buckeyes.
There are massive CFP implications to this one. It's interesting. I was talking about this with Barry Alvarez earlier in the week. It really is at the point where, until proven otherwise, if you lose 2 games, you're out, right? So you get one mulligan along the way, and one of these teams is going to use their mulligan opening weekend. It's really hard to overstate how important it is from that point of view, Bruce.
Yeah, and I think there's also ripple effects to this, too, because USC, a future Big Ten team, is starting to get some hype with Caleb Williams and Jordan Addison, obviously Lincoln Riley going there. With what people think about the Pac-12, there's a couple of big games this week. First of all, you have Florida playing Utah. Utah is the preseason pick to win the Pac-12. And then you have USC, albeit playing Rice, but USC really needs Notre Dame. It would help the Pac-12 immensely if Notre Dame can go in there and upset Ohio State, or at least take them to the wire and look like they can stay with them. If they get blown off the field, I think people are going to go, yeah, Notre Dame's pretty good. They're not a great team. And so, if USC beats them later in the year, it's not going to carry that much weight if this is a team that loses by 21 points in Columbus this weekend.
I like that you're already thinking far enough down the line on relative rooting interests and comparative scores. And I know all that stuff is important, but you're back in college football season when you're thinking about that kind of stuff. A huge game tonight on Fox. I've been excited about this one for months now. Purdue and Penn State. I think Purdue's got a great chance to win the West after we saw them. And Penn State kind of trying to prove that offensively they can be better than they were last year. They were 9th in the Big Ten in scoring offense. As you watch these teams tonight, as you think about the stakes here, what stands out?
Well, I'm excited about this offensive matchup. You have on one side, Jeff Brom's about as good a play caller and offensive mind as there is. We know he loves Aiden O'Connell. We know people are really high about the 2 transfers from Iowa, what they can do in that offense. And, it's just such a problem for defenses. We see he's so good with the screen game. We see he's so creative. And so now Manny Diaz, former Miami coach, he's now, takes over for Brent Pry. How can he slow that, what is going to be coming at him? We know he wants to be aggressive. And on the other side, as you alluded to, I mean, Sean Clifford's there. Everything I've heard is that he looks a lot more comfortable now. It's year 2 with Mike Yurcich. I think in terms of as a not so young quarterback, but he's had a lot of different systems to manage now, right? And so to have some continuity, everything I've heard also about this backfield in Penn State, I think it's going to be fun to see what you have. Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, they have brought a lot more physicality, not just to the running back room, but I think that will help them defensively having to deal with it. From everything I've heard, those guys have been fantastic. So I'm really excited to see their debut tonight.
No, it's remarkable. I mean, you think about 16 straight games without a 100-yard rusher at Penn State. I mean, a team that is.
What is the stat you threw at us the other day? 7 yards?
7 yards was their longest touchdown run last year. Yeah, 7 yards. But it's their longest streak without a 100-yard rusher in 60 years. I got to believe that ends fairly early on this year because both those backs are so talented in Singleton and Allen. What about the Michigan quarterback situation? What's your take on this, Bruce? It's a challenging spot for Jim Harbaugh. What do you think of the solution he's come up with?
I always feel like, that expression, there's a method to the madness.
Yes.
You never, Jim Harbaugh is kind of the outlier to that. You just don't know how it works for him. But especially when it was at Stanford, it always seemed to work for him. It certainly worked for him in the NFL. And then it worked for him last year when, everybody had tried to write him off or did write him off. And so in this case, I think what will be interesting is I feel like this is a much improved receiver room that they have. Certainly getting Ronnie Bell back is huge. We know they have a really good tight end, Eric All, and really good speed in the backfield. And I think they'll be excellent on the O-line. I think, to me, this is not the case of if you have two quarterbacks, you have none. We know what Caden McNamara is. I think they can certainly win and win big with him. I think it's just a case of how much more do we expand the offense with J.J. McCarthy and seeing, is he ready to take the next step? Because they certainly gave him some time last year. I don't think it's just a case of, hey, we don't want one of these guys to transfer. I think with Jim Harbaugh, I think you're really seeing how much can we keep people off balance and how much can we really expand what we know we're already pretty good at.
No, I'm with you, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's not really close. And to your point, that maybe there are things that J.J. McCarthy, I think clearly there are things that J.J. McCarthy does better than Cade McNamara, just as there are things that Cade does better than J.J. But I do think that even though it's not necessarily a preventative measure to keep one of them from transferring, I don't think you would have seen this before the transfer portal era. It's a non-value statement. I just think it's the reality, and I think it's a logical step to try to take as a head coach to try to keep both guys happy. But it is clearly more of a reflection of where we are in college football right now. What about outside of the Big Ten? Is there a team that you look at as you head into the season that isn't in the top 25 right now that you think could end the season there?
Watch out for UCLA. I think they are really potentially dangerous. We saw them at the end of the year just smash USC. They started to get a lot more into a rhythm. Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who feel like he has been there forever. He has become a little more consistent. Zach Charbonnet is a name that obviously Big Ten fans will remember from his days at Michigan. He's one of the best running backs on the West Coast. He really fits Chip Kelly's offense because he is a physical running back and he has great vision. And this is a team, especially with Kelly's play calling and game planning, he is going to give people problems now with all the unbalanced stuff. And they will put three tight ends out there. And I think Charbonnet fits with that. They brought in a bunch of transfers, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think you're looking at a team that will start out 5-0 and then has a chance when Utah comes in there, I think, to really grab the spotlight. I mean, I think it took them a while to kind of rebuild the roster how he wanted it and kind of establish the culture he wanted. And I think they got that last year. And now they've really, I think, supplemented with the transfer portal. They did a good job of that before, but I think from everything I've heard coming out of camp there this summer, it's been something very different in terms of the athleticism they have on defense. And I think they're the team that is kind of laying in the weeds because there's been all the hype on USC and their transfers. I think it's UCLA is the one that's kind of the dark horse on the West Coast.
Bruce, I like that I asked you to go outside the Big Ten and you went with a future Big Ten member. I
didn't even think about it.
I like the way that you are thinking. Hey, it's a huge night. I know you guys on FS1 have a doubleheader that you'll be a part of in the studio. We obviously are really excited to have Minnesota on our air tonight, and everyone will be watching Purdue and Penn State as well. It's just a smorgasbord of excitement as we kick in earnest into week 1 of college football. Appreciate you taking the time on a busy day.
Always a pleasure, Dave. Can't wait to watch the games tonight.
Illinois and Indiana tomorrow night. The Illini already with a game under their belts. They pounded Wyoming 38-6, more than doubled the Cowboys' yardage output in that one. As for the Hoosiers, this will be their season opener. Certainly have some unknowns. They picked up 13 players in the portal, 5 new assistants, including new coordinators on both sides of the ball. Tom Allen, the head coach of the Hoosiers, joins us. He is today's big interview. And, Coach, let's start there. You're opening up with a conference game, at least for you. This is kind of a new trend we've seen here in the Big Ten over the last few years. It certainly gets fans interested, as we know, gets people fired up for the beginning of the season. Do you like this as a coach, starting with a game against a conference opponent?
Well, this is going to be my 4th one since I've been here for the last 6 years as head coach, so I'm kind of getting used to it. I think there's no doubt there's a lot of positives for sure. It obviously creates a high-stakes game right out of the gate, but does heighten the sense of urgency during your preparation, both the summer and in fall camp. So we don't control the schedule, so we're excited about it, and I can't wait to get this thing started tomorrow night.
As we mentioned, it is a little different because Illinois has played a game. What did you learn about them in that first week against Wyoming?
Well, I tell you what, they were impressive. You know, their defense was just stayed in kind of a base look and was able to be very, very effective, long and athletic, tackled well, did a great job, did a lot of hands on the football in the secondary, which was impressive. And then their offense is just multiple. Got a really, really talented running back in Chase Brown, which I think we all knew, and big, lean, moves well up front on the offensive line, big tight ends. Tommy Vito, the quarterback, is really, I think he's a great fit for what they want to do. And he's got a lot of moxie and poise to him. And then Isaiah Williams is a talented receiver, and they got a bunch of other weapons as well. So very well-rounded football team, and Coach Bielema's doing a great job.
Coach, can you use the fact that they have not seen you and you have seen them as an advantage in any way? I mean, can this work in your favor?
Well, there's pros and cons. You know, in a lot of ways, it'd be great to have had a first game to work out some kinks and jitters and all. But they obviously haven't seen us, so I think there's no question the unknown creates a little bit of, in your preparation process, some ability to maybe do more things that you have to consider as possibilities. But also, you know, they have the advantage of having played. So it's probably 50-50 on that one.
Well, one of the areas where you do have the element of surprise here in your back pocket is the quarterback spot. You have not publicly named a starter, but give people a little bit of insight. I think people know a little bit about Jack Tuttle. We've certainly seen him here in recent years for IU. Tell us about Connor Bazelak, the Missouri transfer, and what stood out about him in camp.
Yeah, I think we have, you know, both individuals, I believe, are guys that can be starting quarterbacks in the Big Ten, you know. So obviously we've already seen Jack with us, and then, you know, Connor's a guy that came here, played a lot of football at Missouri, and has a tremendous amount of poise and ability to be able to just sit in there and make his reads and make the throws he needs to make. So it's been a really, really heated competition from starting last spring all the way through the summer and into fall camp. So both these guys have a lot of strengths, and I'll tell you what, I'm excited to be able to have both as part of our offense.
You have a new offensive coordinator as well in Walt Bell, a guy who has Big Ten experience, of course, also has been a head coach. I always find it interesting when a coach with a defensive background is choosing an offensive coordinator, right? Because the notion would be you're trying to hire someone who would give you challenges, game planning as a defensive coach. What is it about Walt Bell in particular that made it feel like he was the right fit for you?
Well, you know, the charge is to bring in an individual that's going to be the head coach of the offense, and from a cultural perspective as well as, you know, play calling, scheme, and all those things. He's going to be given a lot of autonomy because I'm a defensive guy and I'm going to focus on that side of the football, and so I wanted to be able to have that level of confidence in a person. And for me, you know, we have a guy in Walt that I, you know, went against and was able to defend as a defensive coordinator when he was offensive coordinator at Maryland, and so being able to see him make adjustments in game and throughout the season and different things schematically. So that was big for me to be able, because you really don't know. It's play calling is a, you know, it's an art. It's not a science, and there's a feel to it, and the guy has to show he can do that, and that's where I think he's proven that, you know, in the places he's been. And so to me, it was just the conflict that he put us in that I felt as we defended him in the past was a big draw to be able to get him in front of our guys, and then obviously the more we got to know him, we knew he was the right guy.
That'll be one of the interesting storylines with your team. I think another really interesting one is with you now going back to that role as a defensive play caller. And we've talked about this in the past with you because you've been in that role on and off, and just kind of this notion of it's much harder, it's much more unusual, maybe would be the better way to put it, for a head coach to be a defensive play caller than to be an offensive play caller. And you know, maybe again, part of the luxury here is that you do have a former head coach in Walt Bell who is your offensive play caller. But what's kind of that balancing act of engaging with your defense, of understanding kind of where the game's going and game planning for the next series without missing anything in your head coach role?
Yeah, that is definitely the true challenge of the situation, and we've experienced that in the past, having done this before. And I think having the right guy on the sideline as your defensive coordinator to organize them, to make those adjustments, to be able to take the defense to the sideline. And we've set that up. Chad runs all of our meetings. He's the guy that does all the adjustments throughout practice, and being able to organize the things we need to do, and the communication with him, with the players, the other coaches, is really, really important. So I can be able to, you know, obviously I'm still in the headset, we'll be able to talk, and there'll be times when I go over there, but I got to be the head coach of the team and while the offense is on the field. So having a person that you trust to be able to make those adjustments, get great information from our guys in the press box, be able to accurately take the information and get it to our guys and make the proper adjustments is going to be key. And so having done that in the past, I know that having a guy like that's critical. King Womack was that guy for me before he became the play caller, and that's something that we were looking for when I hired Chad. So I love Chad. He's a tremendous asset to our program, and he brings a lot of qualities that I know are going to allow us to be successful on game day, because he has to be me to that defense when I'm with the offense.
Coach, last year was such a tough year for you, and injuries had so much to do with it. I mean, I'm not sure I've seen a team quite as snake-bitten as you, and particularly at really important positions. For instance, quarterback, but you lost 20 players to season-ending injuries. Was there anything that you have done differently now since the end of last year, up to and including going through camp, to try to avoid a similar situation, or do you just think it was kind of luck and happenstance and just a bad year on that front?
Yeah, it's a fair question, because the numbers are staggering, and it was devastating. We lost too many of the wrong guys without question. But bottom line is we had to go back and evaluate why. And so we went through that from a medical perspective, evaluate all the injuries when they happened, you know, whether in practice and games and different things like that. And we did make changes, you know, and trying to do some things to be able to manage a year-long calendar of guys who trained for the full year, how we managed our reps and the physicality we had during spring football, during fall camp, the way we structured our practices, and the way we built up our conditioning in the offseason. So there were a lot of ligament injuries, which those are kind of tough to avoid in some ways. But at the same time, we were doing everything we could possibly do to be able to prevent them. And I know they're part of the game, but the bottom line is, yes, we made a lot of adjustments and changes with that. Aaron Williams has been a big part of that. Our training staff has been a big part of that. So we tried to, you know, look at everything and try and find a way to prevent them for the future.
Tom, another thing you did to try to change the narrative from last season was you had a lot of new personnel in addition to a strong recruiting class. 13 players from the portal, as I mentioned off the top of this segment, 5 new assistants, the 2 new coordinators that we've talked about. You are such a family guy. You've created this family in your program, love each other. You talk about that all the time. This is the reality of college football now, right? College sports in general. It's going to be a little more transient, or significantly more transient than it's been in the past. So how do you marry those two? How do you continue to create a family atmosphere when you're welcoming more people than you typically would into the family each year?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question in regards to the culture and climate of the college sports right now, with the transfer portal and the way there's more movement. But I think it's still, relationships are never going to cease to be at the foundation of who we are and what we're building here. And so those relationships have to be built maybe in a little more faster way in some ways, be able to still find guys that fit with us, whether coming from another university or coming, you know, out of high school. Same with coaches. And we did a lot of things. We probably doubled our effort this offseason to build those connections and build those relationships with our players and with each other and with the coaching staff, with the players as well. And so to me, it was just a heightened sense of just trying to get our guys to spend as much possible time together as we could to be able to get them connected. And it was back to fit. You know, even though you may not recruit a guy quite as long, we recruited a lot of these guys from the portal that we already knew, had recruited maybe out of high school, knew their families. That was the case with Connor Bazelak. He'd already been to campus for a visit, knew his family, those kind of things. So I could say the same thing for Everett several other players that we got from the portal. So, and also had a lot of strong connection with coaches that coach those guys. So still just trying to find guys that fit with us and just build a group, because to me, the best team, that's what you're trying to build, because the best team, that's who wins on game day.
Coach, can't wait to see this 2022 version of the Hoosiers starting tomorrow night. I know IU fans are excited. It should be a really good game. Illinois and Indiana tomorrow night. We really appreciate you taking the time out. I know things are busy on the eve of a game, but thanks so much for talking to us today.
You're welcome. Good to see you, Dave. Have an awesome day.
Likewise. Take care, Coach. Back on Big Ten today, as we discussed with Bruce Feldman, Michigan will start Cade McNamara Saturday against Colorado State. And then next week, J.J. McCarthy will get his first career start against Hawaii. McNamara, the more accurate of the two QBs last year. TD to interception ratios were actually identical. McCarthy more fleet of foot. He averaged nearly 5 yards per carry, while McNamara was at less than 1. Jerry rejoins me. And Jerry, they have a cushy non-conference schedule, so they do kind of have this luxury. It's an unusual situation at quarterback. It's compounded by somewhat of an unusual situation with the offensive coordinators. Josh Gaddis has moved on. You have co-coordinators, Sharon Moore and Matt Weiss. They are splitting between the run game and the pass game. So tell me how all of this kind of works together. How do you marry all of this?
Yeah, how do you marry it and how do you organize it? But before I address that, I'd say this. We had the feeling that Michigan was as good as it's been since the network started, right? I mean, they just seem, I know they lost in the semifinals, and they look like a playoff team.
Yes.
Even though they've lost a lot of good players and so on. You just got the feel like when you go to Ohio State that they're going to be in championship hunt. So just that's some of the reasons why I'm coming to the point. You're always going to lose coordinators when you have a program like that. And Jim has lost his two play callers and two of his coordinators. And so now on defense, he has Sharon Moore, who coaches the offensive line, and Matt Weiss, who coaches the quarterbacks. So they're co-coordinators. The issue comes who calls the plays. And, you know, they know, I'm sure. They've never said it to us directly, but I have a feeling it's going to be more Sharon Moore than it is Matt Weiss. Sharon is the offensive line coach. He's a run game guy, obviously, by virtue of his position. Him and Jim, I think, are more closely aligned. Not that Jim doesn't want to throw the ball. But when you say, I'm going to call the runs and you're going to call a pass, who decides if you're going to run a pass,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So there's a logistical issue. How big is the issue? Well, it's really big on first down. And it's really big on the second first down. Like if it's in between series, we're probably talking about it because our defense is holding. They're going to punt. We're probably going to get the ball on the 40-yard line. So actually all three of us could have a conversation. Hey, you want to run? You want to pass? All right, we pass. Matt, what do you got? Sharon, what do you have if we run? It's that second first down, or it's the continual drives. And so that's unusual. Josh Gaddis called all the plays. And if you look at the Michigan-Ohio State game, there were some really creative plays that Michigan took advantage of Ohio State's defense. In fact, we're gonna look at some of that on Urban Analysis. And so that's an organizational thing. On defense, I think it's a lot different, right? You got Jesse Minter, pretty much the same defense, but one play caller. And so the titles aren't as important as how the process is. I think I mentioned this to you. I was at Colorado. I was the offensive coordinator. Gary Barnett was the quarterback coach. I mean,
is he any good?
I mean, if we were living in these times, he'd have been co-offensive coordinator.
Right.
And it was never really a problem. But it does take some time to get used to it. You mentioned the schedule. A weaker non-conference schedule is a really good advantage for a new process.
No doubt. I mean, you get time to work this out. This is amazingly the first time in 78 years that Michigan will not either play what is currently a Power 5 school or Notre Dame in the non-conference. So it's as cushy as it's been really in just about anybody's lifetime who follows Michigan football. Quickly on Wisconsin, who are the people you'll be watching most closely with the Badgers tomorrow?
Okay,
Saturday, I'm sorry.
Yeah, first is Bobby Ingram, new offensive coordinator, someone that's been hired to call the plays, to coach the quarterback, and hopefully to get the run game involved. Then Jim Leonard. He has to replace a lot of guys on defense. He's done that before. He has to do it. Graham Mertz. They expect a lot from Graham Mertz. He was having a good camp, not a great camp when we were there. And the fourth person is Paul Christ, who's now become a CEO. What's he going to be doing all game? And what's his role? And how's he's a great play caller, and yet he's not going to be calling plays. So to me, when I think of this game being a one-sided looks like a one-sided matchup. I look at those 4 people as making a significant difference in the program, and especially against Illinois State.
And I do think when you have a team in transition, new offensive coordinator, a lot of new players on defense, right? It does help to have, there's a reason people like to schedule games like this. I know we were talking to Tom, and hey, this is the trend with conference games, but you got to believe Paul Chryst is happy to have one where he can kind of work things out.
I know we have to go, but the maturity factor is something that you look at with Wisconsin because they're an established program.
One more look at that complete Week 1 slate. We've got 2 games tonight, 2 games tomorrow. We haven't mentioned Michigan State yet, but they play their traditional Friday opener. They will take on Western Michigan. Then Saturday, Maryland tries to build on last year's bowl win, hosting Buffalo. Iowa's got the Jackrabbits, got Rutgers scoring off of BC, among other games. Nebraska back on the field, taking on North Dakota. Let's start, though, with Maryland. Really impressive in camp. What are you most interested in seeing against Buffalo?
Their attitude and their maturity going into the game. Mike Loxley worked for Nick Saban at Alabama. There's nothing more boring in college football than a coach saying the process, right? I mean, that is boring stuff. But in this case, it's very relative, right? This is a building program. Be mature. You're a better program than Buffalo. You have better players. And then the other thing would be Brian Williams, defensive coordinator. He took over last year. They won the last 2 games. This program has to be complete only when Brian Williams and the defensive staff improve on defense. No big plays, play clean on offense, limit the big plays on defense.
Got to force some turnovers, too. They only forced 4 in the last 9 games last year. They've got to figure out a way to stop turning it over on offense and to force some turnovers on D. What about Iowa? What stood out to you when we were at camp with the reigning West champs?
Maybe one of the best defenses they've had. It predicts to be maybe the best defense under Phil Parker, defensive coordinator. Offensively, you know, everyone talks about their pass game, and they've got to be better in the pass game, and yet they played in the championship game last year. I'm one of those people that say they have to get better in the pass game. But it's not like Wisconsin where they're going to change schemes, or we think they may change schemes. It's just a frequency that they call the pass on 1st and 10. 2nd and 10 is the worst down in football for your offensive play caller. So Brian Ferentz is cautious, but this is a team maybe that we see more towards a balanced 1st and 10 play calling game.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to have an explosive offense to be good because you know how good Phil Parker's defense is going to be. I mean, 6 straight years allowing less than 20 points per game. It's the longest streak of any team in the country.
But you always put yourself at risk against teams with less talent if you're not explosive offensively. Because someone can keep it close, make a couple plays. And so they're in a situation where, you know, the heck with 50-50 on 1st and 10. We're going to get a lead, you know, and then when you're in a close game, it's that same old. It's a dilemma for a play caller. It's not an easy solution. It's not like, Brian, throw the ball more. That's not the answer.
Right. Finally, Rutgers, challenging opener against BC. What do you make of this matchup?
Yeah, I don't love the matchup just because I think teams like Rutgers, they've had good non-conference schedule. I mean, they've had a fair non-conference schedule. This one seems to be a little tougher. I think the advantage with this is Boston College recruits into New Jersey, so it kind of impacts recruiting, the result of the game. It probably helped them in camp towards the end, and so, you know, this is a tough go. They also have a new defensive coordinator. They also have some coaches that have moved around, running back coach, the offensive line, and back and forth. So there's also a mechanic issue that they have. An away game at BC, new mechanics, it'll be a challenge.
You mentioned a lot when we see them. I know you've just been really impressed with Greg Schiano and just kind of the way that he's overhauled this program, how well coached they are. How does that manifest itself in camp, and how can that translate in Week 1?
I think you get more players ready. What was so impressive about Greg Schiano's practice is that there was always 2 groups working at one time. There weren't these long lines. So the first 2 teams were working with the full-time coaches, and then maybe the 3s and the 4s in certain drills were working with the graduate assistants. And not everyone does that. But his practice looked a lot like PJ. PJ worked for Greg Schiano, and you could tell from the loudspeaker to some of the drill work, very similar. So I think more players are probably ready in their program.
Going to be interesting to see who the quarterback is.
It's got to be Noah Vedral, right?
I mean.
But Greg said he's not afraid to play more than one, which means he's going to play more than one.
The guy just like no one's talking about is Evan Simon, who was good the day that we were there. I mean, I get everyone wants to see Gavin Wimsatt, and he's got a huge arm. But every time Greg has a chance to talk about the quarterbacks, he mentions Evan Simon.
And you mentioned him on the bus as we were eating cannolis. So I knew the cannolis were good, right?
Man.
Ooh. Not to mention the calzones.
Yeah. No, the whole thing.
Or the pasta.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we
Italian
are
cookies.
we are always well fed when we go to Rutgers.